Hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I'm Frank Rausen Pereira. Well, India's stature at the global stage has grown multifold over the past decade. We have assumed leadership of the global south and championed the cause of dialogue and peace through multilaterals. India today is a force to reckon with and has a seat at the world high table. We are now a more proactive global player. Yet, the nature of foreign policy is such that we have to always be cautious and nimble-footed to adapt to the ever-changing dynamics of geopolitics. India's foreign policy has manoeuvred adeptly through tricky waters and ensured that we put our interest first. However, with the new president in the United States, two major wars, a seeming shift away from globalisation and a troubled neighbourhood, all make for an interesting 2025. On the program today, we will analyse India's foreign policy priorities in 2025. And to discuss this, I have with me Dhruva Jayashankar, Executive Director of Observer Research Foundation, America, and Suresh K. Goel, former ambassador. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on this special telecast. Ambassador, let me begin the program with you first and try and understand how has India's foreign policy changed over the last decade?
Frank, on the surface of it, it is a simple question, but the fact is that the way things have happened over the last several years, there is no simple answer. It has changed. It has changed in many ways, but how it has changed, I think we need to look at it very carefully. Number one, there are two things which you mentioned already, the global south and the muscular India. I think over the last 10 years, in fact, even before that, with the growing economic clout of India, growing economic strength of India, where we are able to leverage our market size, where we are able to leverage our growth and our technological capacities in the global markets. We are able to really project a muscular India. And in that sense, one distinction that I would like to make is that while before these 10 years, we knew where we were, we knew that we had leverages, but we were not really overly expressive about it, if I can say so. We were rather coy about what we had. That changed. And rather than being coy, we have become more assertive, and we have become, in fact, the word that I wanted to use was aggressive, but this rather an aggressive word. But the fact is that we have tried to punch way, way, way above our weights very often, number one. Number two, in the meantime, over the last 3 or 4 years, what has happened is that the world geopolitics has changed. Middle East. Now, we all know what Hamas did in Israel. We all know that. But Israeli response was not totally anticipated. Whatever the reasons may be, that response from Israel in the Middle East had changed the complete equation in that area. And today we are talking about a Middle East where perhaps Palestinians or Palestine will be a very, very marginal role to play.
Right. And
that is changing the whole Arab equation. Number three, Ukraine. The whole European geopolitics has changed. And I'm being very, very brief here now. And lastly, the China. Just 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, China was on the rise, the market size, the rapid GDP growth and everything. And we thought that China is the next superpower in the world. And China may still be there. But the fact is that Chinese economy has begun to betray against that kind of a goal. So I think China, Europe, Middle East, they all combine into a very, very different kind of a geopolitical situation, which India has to face, and whether India has the strength to be able to emerge a winner in this whole geopolitical game is a different thing.
Absolutely.
Frank.
Absolutely. Points well taken. Let me take the discussion forward now with you. Dhruva, let me bring you into the picture now, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well. and look at how India's foreign policy has become more proactive. I think that's the key word really as far as what we've seen over the last decade.
No, yes, I mean I would agree with a lot of what has been said so far. I mean so I have a book out recently called Vishwashastra, which does two things. It tries to give a history, comparative history, looking back before independence, but certainly after 1947, of how India interacted with the world in different ways at different times. And then also the second part of the book proposes ways forward as well. And I think the 5 big changes I would identify, I would say these have been accumulative over the last 30 years, since roughly 1991 or so, although there have been periods of acceleration. I think the last 10 years we've seen some acceleration in these trends. But the 5 big trends I would point to, one is the integration of the Indian economy with the global economy. That you had a relatively much more isolated Indian economy prior to 1991, and it has opened up and now more integrated, which has also allowed India to play a greater role in whether it's energy markets or emerging technologies, software, telecommunications, a number of other areas. Second is been going from a degree of deep distrust with the US and its Western allies, including Israel, but in Japan, Europe. And there are many reasons for that, which I get into in a lot of detail, including India's nuclear program, to an area where these are much more constructive partnerships, not without their differences, but with much more degree of cooperation. Third has been a dehyphenation from India-Pakistan. And for many years, until quite recently, I would say until 2008 at least, the world often tried to balance its relations between India and Pakistan. Today, I think we're much past that. Today, people treat India on its own merits and Pakistan on its own merits, to increasingly looking at China as the pacing challenge. 4, looking at a broader region beyond South Asia. So between 1971 and 1991, India was very focused on Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, including military interventions in these areas, to now looking at a much broader Indo-Pacific region. And 5th, exchanging the rhetoric of the developing world, or just the developing world, to that of a rising power, along with the BRICS initially and then other countries, including in the G20. India now positions itself as a rising power and has adopted the rhetoric and position of a rising power. So these, I think, have been the big changes we've seen over the past decade, but some of this goes back, I'd say, 30 years.
Absolutely. Thank you for so beautifully, just stitching all of that together and letting us know exactly how things have changed really as far as India's foreign policy is concerned. Now, let's look ahead. Ambassador, I'd like to bring you in here now. What should India's foreign policy priorities be in the year ahead, basically in 2025?
Again, Frank, a very, very difficult question, because I think the contest here is between our neighborhood, which comprises China, and the USA. And I'm comparing, these are 2 completely different things really, but at the same time related. Number 1, if you look at why the USA is paying so much attention to India now, and it is not just Joe Biden or Trump, it started happening in 1991 as we began to grow in economic size. But the fact is that America is certainly getting closer to India, if not closer, paying more attention to what India is all about. Why is that so? And I think essentially because, and I'm basically really now a China shop as a bull. What is happening here, for the USA, the biggest challenge in the global power equation is China. And if you want to talk about China, the only one country which actually come in comparison to China, either economically, geopolitically, or geostrategically, is India. And therefore, India began to look at, USA began to look at India as Quad, as a power balancer in the East Western Pacific. India as a kind of country with which it could partner. But India has been rather shy of being completely in the American camp. So here we have a situation whether the USA would like to go with India as a kind of a power partner, a military partner, strategic partner, and India will like to basically retain its own independence of thought and action and whatever strategic autonomy. Given that kind of a factor, I think what India has to do is to really decide the kind of a role it wants to play now in the world. And that's a difficult decision, Frank, if I may say so. There are no easy answers, but we need to really discover our own place in the world.
Absolutely. We have to discover our own place in the world, and I think we are very succinctly doing that as well. We've seen with the leadership of the Global South, or be it the G20 presidency, and how we handled everything over the last couple of years. Dhruv, I'd like to bring you in now. You know, a lot of thought, a lot of discussion, a lot has been said about, you know, the new president of the United States, Mr. Donald Trump. How do you see the bilateral ties between the two countries going forward under the new president?
I mean, briefly, I think, you know, largely, I would imagine the relationship will get stronger. The partnership will get stronger over the next few years. I don't think there's any, you know, the US has a number of other major challenges, both short-term and long-term. The long-term, as Ambassador Goel correctly pointed out, the US sees China as the major challenge. It also has immediate crises in Russia, between Russia, Ukraine, the war, and Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East to deal with as well. So there are a number of immediate, you know, issues of immigration, illegal immigration, and others. So India is not a high priority in that sense, at least short term. But largely, the U.S. government, I think, regardless of party, is positively disposed towards better relations with India. I anticipate we'll have some short-term challenges related to trade issues. Again, this is not India-specific. I think largely Trump will use tariffs much more liberally against other countries that he deems to be benefiting too much from a trade relationship with the U.S. We'll also have some difficulties on immigration, which is uncertain. But I think barring trade and immigration issues in the short term, I anticipate this will largely continue to be a cooperative partnership. But on the issue of, you know, broader issue of what our priorities, again, I would say the first one for India, I think, will be at home, which is improving military preparedness, particularly given China's very rapid military mobilization that is underway, both maritime, and you'll increasingly see a Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, but also on the border. And then secondly, building up economic resilience and self-sufficiency in key areas, particularly in critical technological areas. This will be a contest in the near future, particularly in a more adverse international trade environment. But other additional challenges will continue to be in the neighborhood, where you know, India will have to contend with the growing nationalism and sovereignty and democratization in Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives. And they will also start looking at outside powers, including China, for alternatives. And so this is something India will have to contend with, and therefore devote much more time and attention to the neighborhood. Three, on the Indo-Pacific, maintaining a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific given China's rise, and also concerns about U.S. Withdrawal as well, the U.S. pulling back, and what that means for the broader balance of power. There are also great opportunities to India's west, and I think while the Pakistan issue will have to continue to be managed, particularly the use of terrorism under a nuclear umbrella, there are opportunities, as Ambassador Goel mentioned earlier, which is we now have partners in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, who want to see greater economic integration with India. And so an India-Middle East economic corridor that you know, becomes a source of investment, becomes a source of connectivity will be important. And finally, I think on global governance issues, which is reforming existing institutions, including the UN Security Council, including the Bretton Woods institutions, creating new ones, whether it is building up you know, BRICS or the Quad or International Solar Alliance on specific issues, and finally empowering the Global South as well, whose objectives largely align with India's own objectives on multilateral governance. So I think these will be the main priorities going forward. Regardless, you know, some of the nature of that will change under with Trump as president, but ultimately the broader objectives will not change.
Absolutely. You know, Dhruva, hold that thought. I'm going to come back to you, you know, on what kind of opportunities are in store for India going forward in 2025. And we'll also talk about, you know, where we stand with regards to trying to fulfill those opportunities as well. But before that, let me bring in the ambassador as well and talk about another important aspect that you brought up about the neighborhood. Of course, we've discussed China already, but ambassador, what about other neighbors, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and more importantly, Bangladesh?
Frank, when we look at our neighborhood, I think our neighborhood has learned how to play the Chanakyan theory of Mandala much better than what we have learned really, even though Chanakya came from our country. We pay lip service. The fact is that all these neighboring countries, whether it's Bangladesh or Nepal or Bhutan was coming to my mind, but thank God, fortunately, Bhutan still has remained a good friend and not playing the game altogether. But most of these countries, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Maldives, they've learned to play the game. They know how to hedge. And the fact is that we, if I may say so, even though I think I would like to be questioned here by the group, the fact is that we are falling into the trap. We are basically allowing them to play the game rather than telling them. The example comes to my mind when Atal Bihari Vajpayee, even though it was domestic politics, he told the opposition parties where they have to stop and where they can't go. The fact is that even in our own neighborhood, we need to learn where they're coming from and what they want. And therefore, I think this India-China contest in the neighborhood, we have to learn to play the game, and we have not learned it very well, even if I say so myself. Take example of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, as soon as they learned, they depend upon India to get the IMF funds for their own budgeting. They played the game. They knew that they had to take the Indian support. Maldives, once they learned that there is a limit to what China can do with them, they learned the game. They came to us. I think rather than getting agitated about what China can do, we must focus on what we can do in the neighborhood. Bangladesh, example. Bangladesh is basically Pakistan, essentially. And even though there are allegations about other countries playing a role, but I think we need to let them know how advantageous it could be for them to be with India. And again, we need to really, but it remains very important for us because in the neighborhood, we have got two countries who will continue to really play the game against us, and that is Pakistan and China, who are together on the geopolitical front. So there we are. Unless we, and I think we have done better this time with Maldives, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka. Bangladesh is a bit if.
Absolutely. Well, the internal politics of Bangladesh is such that it becomes a utterly complex matter. But like the ambassador has just pointed as well, I think in Maldives, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, and of course Bhutan is an all-weather friend. But in these three countries, we have actually learned to play the game. We've seen some overtures from Maldives that have been extremely positive after the kind of campaign that Mizu ran against India, Nepal as well. KP Sharma Oli sending emissaries to Delhi to try and get an audience with the Honorable Prime Minister to try and sort out issues too. Dhruv, let me bring you back into the picture now, and let's try and understand, this complex issue of neighborhood politics, where things stand and how we are dealing with the kind of game that the ambassador just told us about.
Right. So, I think two things need to be taken into account for context purpose, for the purposes of context. One is, I think there are some structural realities that India has to contend with in its neighborhood. And by this, I specifically mean Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, to some extent Bhutan as well. And the fact is, these are all polities that are in their own way democratizing. The public space is becoming more open relative to 10, 20, 30 years ago, where you had monarchy, an absolute monarchy in Nepal, you had, single party rule effectively in Sri Lanka and a civil war, you had dictatorships in Bangladesh. So you're seeing this sort of opening up of public space. Secondly, these are all sovereignty conscious countries. And you have a question of ethnic overlap. So their politics obviously overlap with politics in India, whether it's Tamil politics in Sri Lanka, or Bengali and Assamese politics in Bangladesh, or Bihar UP politics in Nepal. So these are, I think, some realities we have to contend with. It's also true that just by virtue of the size and geography, that for many of these countries, India will remain a constant in their in their policy environments. That is, it is the larger country, it is a neighbor, and so India will matter. Now, that being said, there is also the second consideration is there is a long history of these countries trying to leverage outside powers to gain bargaining power with India. And this goes back, in Nepal's case, to the 1960s, where they settled their border with China, where Indian forces were told to leave. In the 1980s, Bangladesh turned to China again for military equipment under the Zia government there, and the Zia-ur-Rahman. Sri Lanka, actually one of the reasons India intervened in the IPKF intervention in the 1980s was to forestall the possibility of the US playing a bigger role in Sri Lanka. So India was concerned about US activism in the Indian Ocean region and actually wanted to preempt that. So this is not a new problem. I think the challenge is we had a period, despite the attempts of Prime Minister Gujral and others to focus a bit more on the neighborhood, we had a period where India neglected the neighborhood to a great degree. We had a 10-year period, for example, where no Indian Prime Minister visited Nepal, even though it's a 1.5-hour flight away to Kathmandu. And even that previous visit by Prime Minister Vajpayee was for a SAARC summit, not even a bilateral visit. So we had a 12-year period almost where no Indian Prime Minister visited Nepal. That's, I think, just indicative of the neglect in some ways that India put into its neighborhood. Now, one of the big changes, I think, has been now changing that. And Prime Minister Modi, his first 2 foreign visits were to Bhutan and Nepal. Bangladesh became the largest recipient of lines of credit. Sri Lanka has been the single largest recipient of a bilateral financial package, which India has never done, to tune about $4.5 billion US. So there has been this attention paid, and we're starting to see some of the dividends, which is despite the political volatility in all of these countries, in Nepal, Bangladesh, especially Sri Lanka, Maldives, you have seen leaders of very different dispensations understanding the need to have to work with India to certain degrees. Absolutely. And I think the concern that India needs to communicate, and has been trying to communicate, is we're willing to work with you if you are willing to take into account some of our core considerations. And one of those is security considerations. If you start seeing these countries not take into account Indian security concerns, there will be, this will obviously fray relations with New Delhi. So I think that this is what is having to be done. Bangladesh, I think, is in a particularly difficult period today, just because of the very drastic political change we saw over the past few months. We'll have to see whether that continues. But so far, they will also understand that other countries, for example, the US and Europe and others, are more distant and will not be paying attention to Bangladesh to the same extent. It will not be as much of a priority to Washington, for example, as it is for New Delhi. And so ultimately, they will have to work with Delhi and also be, again, cognizant of certain concerns that India might have.
Absolutely. Very rightly said. All right. Time to get closing comments now from both the panelists with the best way forward and what next, starting first with you, Ambassador.
I have 1 or 2 suggestions.
Right.
I think we have fallen prey to basically mixing our foreign policy with, I'm sorry, wrong use the word, not really mixing, but basically letting our foreign policy be hostage to the regional dynamics, where Pakistan uses the religion card very effectively. It has done so in many areas of India. It has been able to get international sympathy, if not support, what they say. I think we need to do 2 or 3 things. I think Global South platform that Prime Minister Modi created, the last G20 meeting, was a very good one. We need to really develop more on the Global South platform so that we are seen as a country not just close to the USA because we are an emerging power, but as a country which is championing the rights of and the ambitions of the countries in Africa and Latin America, etc., etc., etc. Number 1. Number 2. One area which we have completely ignored in our foreign policy constantly, with the exception of remittances that we get from the people in those countries, is the Middle East. Now, lip service being paid apart about the MECC corridor, this and this. I think we need to be playing a more active role in the Middle Eastern politics. simply because we have been close to Palestine, we are close to Israel. I think both Israel and the people from Saudi Arabia and the Islamic countries, I'm using the word very carefully, they trust us. Let us play the game there, and that will also take off the edge from the religious angle.
Right.
Once we have been able to do that, I think we are at least playing the role as a global leader. And that's what I would like to really do for the time being.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Time is limited, yes.
And I think it is time, and the time is ripe. I think 2025 is when we are going to see India truly emerge on the global stage and become a true global leader, because we have already done so much in the recent past. Dhruva, let me close the show with you with your final comments on the program, on how diplomacy, of course, is dynamic. Foreign policy keeps changing every now and then, but that also provides us or presents several opportunities as well. Your thoughts on that?
I mean, I actually think the Middle East has been the biggest area of change, well, one of the biggest areas of change, I think, in the past few years. And I mean, if one had to put a starting point on it, I would say it was MBZ, the now president of the UAE, his visit for Republic Day in 2017. Because the relationships to India's West were often defined through a Pakistan lens originally, which was in some ways India was on the defensive. It was very late in recognizing Israel, only in 1992, because of concerns about how much of the Arab world and the Islamic world would react to that. But the fact is, I think there's some very sweeping changes underway there in that region, and particularly in the post-Arab Spring environment, which is you have leadership changes in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman. You have, they're all planning in some ways for a post-fossil fuel economy. They are also they have serious concerns about political Islamism, so radical political Islamism, and what they witnessed happen after the Arab Spring, particularly in Egypt, but also Syria and Libya, is, I think, a concern for many of these leaders of these countries. So they are reaching out as a consequence to India on the one hand and to Israel on the other. And the Abraham Accords that were announced a few years ago are in some ways a manifestation of that. So we're, I think, at a stage where there are these very radical political changes underway, political and economic changes. India is a net beneficiary of that, or can be a net beneficiary of that, but it will require a lot of patient work going forward. And ultimately, what was once a relationship defined by the diaspora, energy, and security is today a much more multifaceted one. You have a very large number of Indian students in Saudi Arabia, to give one example. The level of trade and investment, two-way, between India and the GCC is now huge, rivaling, in some ways surpassing Europe as a trade partner. So this has become a you go to Dubai or Abu Dhabi today, and it's a much more multifaceted relationship today than it was a while ago. And I think that we're just at the beginning of what could be very transformative period for India-Gulf ties in the years ahead.
Absolutely, very rightly said. All right. I'd like to thank both my panelists for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective. For us, what's coming out of this discussion, the key word is trust. The world trusts India, and it's going to present a lot of opportunities going forward, something that we should make full use of and ensure that India truly shines on the global stage like it has been doing in the recent past. Thank you once again to both my panelists. That's it on this edition of this special telecast on Sansad TV. I'm Frank Rausen Pereira signing off. See you again next time.
To watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and share them.